Hello, brothers and sisters. Welcome to the beginning of a new week, the fourth week after Pentecost. Halfway through the Apostles' Fast this year, 2 weeks behind us, 2 weeks left. And we're going to continue today working through the um, book of Romans. Today we finish up the ninth chapter. Again, the eighth and ninth chapters are sort of famous for being difficult, but also being very inspirational. The talk about predestination, the talk about um, what it means that God hardened the heart of Pharaoh, that God will have mercy on whom he will have mercy. This discussion basically comes to a close in chapter 9 today. And we've talked a little bit about it already. I think there's just one main thing to understand today. So we pick up, we reread some of the verses that we already read last week. He will have mercy on whom he will have mercy, and whom he will, he hardeneth. And thou wilt say then unto me, why doth he find fault? For who hath resisted his will? And now St. Paul begins his defense of God. So his reader has the objection. Um, doesn't this sound like God makes some people bad? Doesn't this sound like that? And St. Paul begins by saying, who are you as a creation to talk about the creator? What business is it of yours to judge the way that God is doing things? Now, that makes it sound like St. Paul is justifying that God is doing this. Says that yeah, if as a potter uh, makes things, doesn't he have the right to make some things for more honorable purposes, some things for less honorable purposes? No. The key to understanding this whole passage is understanding here that St. Paul is rightly saying that we have no right to judge our Creator. We have no right to question what God has done. However, he is not saying that God actually does these things. This is something that we see in Scripture a lot. In the very beginning of the Bible, uh, God says to Adam and Eve, if you eat from this tree, you will die. He does not say, if you eat from this tree, I will kill you. He's talking about natural consequences. Here, St. Paul starts by saying God, as creator, has the right to do with his creation anything that he wants. And we, as his creation, should learn a little bit of humility and not think that we understand everything and not put ourselves in a place higher than God. But then, if we read this properly, we see right in the next verse, in the 22nd verse, St. Paul basically says, even though God has the right to do this, he actually doesn't do it. So, what if God, willing to show his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath fitted to destruction? So, God has the right to make some vessels for destruction. But this says what God actually does is God actually shows his patience. Again, out of God's justice, once mankind fell into sin, that could have been it. That would have been completely proper, completely fitting. But instead, God shows his mercy. So that is the point that St. Paul makes. And then he goes even further as far as this idea of the St. Paul is actually almost rejecting some of this idea of people being pre-chosen right now. He again, of course, he had said in the previous verses of this chapter, whom he foreknew, he also predestined. And we already talked about how that means that God knows already what's going to happen. He does not predetermine it, but he knows already what is going to happen. And then St. Paul quotes the prophet Hosea here, showing that if we have if this model, this image of God as a potter who made some honorable vessels and some dishonorable vessels, in the end, he showed great patience that he was not required by the law of justice to show. Um, But then he quotes Hosea and says, I will call them my people, which were not my people, and her beloved, which was not beloved. So there, um, even those whom God had not chosen in the Old Testament, God's chosen people were the Jewish people, and the Gentiles were not chosen. And that sounds like this model of the potter that God had made the Jews for honor and the Gentiles for dishonor. And then God decided, no, it's hard to say these things about decided. God doesn't change his mind. God's plan was there all along. But uh, the Gentiles were let into the church. So those pots, those vessels that seemed to be dishonorable, that seemed to be not chosen, were indeed the ones that God chose. So this entire passage actually speaks to us of God's goodness, of how great and how magnanimous God is, in that being God, being just, being perfect, being so far above us, he does have the right to do things that he wants without us questioning him. But in the end, he behaves, as it were, even better than we can imagine. I gave the example a few talks ago. This is something that I heard a priest talking about once, that this is what the why Satanists hate God, because they say he's not fair. He's too kind, and that he needs to punish more. But we see, as a matter of fact, even though he has the right to do that, he gets things done a different way. He gets things done a different way. He does punish us. He does allow things to happen to us to correct us. We talked a little bit about that in church yesterday, about the reading from Romans 5. Um, but he does not destroy us to the end until we have made it totally impossible. It's not that he does not have the power to get through to us, but when we have made it totally impossible, um, then our end comes, or our end comes out of God's mercy, um, before we go too far down the road to sin. Also, we've talked about that um, in these talks. The rest, the apostle is sort of bringing a bit to a close these 9 chapters of interconnected thoughts, and just one more time says that the Jews sought righteousness not by faith but by works, and thus they did not attain it. Again, the law is only something that can give us a help. The Christ says in the gospel, if we do everything we are supposed to do, we should just consider ourselves unworthy servants. The following the law cannot make us righteous, cannot raise us up above everything. It's just what we need to do for self-preservation, for the preservation of ourselves as individuals, and for all of society. So um, again, the apostle is bringing this argument up, maybe for the last time, that righteousness and salvation is imputed through faith. We need the law, but the law is powerless to bring us any higher. We just know that we're doing wrong through the law. We learn what is bad. We learn what it is that is working within us. But just to remember, this is a good thing to notice when reading the Bible. It really looks like, when we read the beginning of this reading today, that St. Paul is basically justifying that uh, God is capricious. God makes some people just in order to destroy them. It sounds like he's justifying that, but if we read carefully, he's just saying that a creator has every right to do this, but our particular creator actually does not, but instead shows mercy and patience. God willing, we'll see you tomorrow.